Support for Swan Song is brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you. 25 years ago today, on March 4th, 1999, Bandai released the WonderSwan in Japan. A few years later, I would come across the WonderSwan while browsing the online import retailer Lixang, RIP, and it seemed like such a sweet system. Hell, they even had an official SDK called the Wonder Witch that you could buy as a regular consumer. That sounded awesome. It looked like there was so much to love about it, and yet when you went to read what the English internet had to say about it, you'd always see the same sentiment. It looks like a cool system on paper, but it's a dumping ground for bad anime license games. 7 years ago, in a window of unemployment between two jobs and equipped with a newly acquired knowledge of the Japanese language, I bought my own WonderSwan and decided to set out on a quest to play and document every title on this thing. There have been a couple bumps along the way, and if I had stuck to my original weekly cadence and hadn't burnt out for a couple of years, I'd probably be done by now. But I was happy to find that the WonderSwan's library is far more nuanced than everyone in the mid-2000s would lead you to believe. I'd even wager to say that most people who were echoing that sentiment never even laid their hands on the thing. This is Swan Song, a chronological survey of the Bandai WonderSwan's game library, and on this special episode to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the system, we're taking a break from the usual software focus so I can take you on a much overdue tour of the system's hardware and history. So let's get right into it. We can't talk about the WonderSwan without first touching on the Game Boy, as it's shockingly relevant to the WonderSwan's history, both as its most significant competition and a weird step-sibling. The original Game Boy was released in 1989 and was a massive success until its discontinuation in 2003. It was designed by Yokoi Gunpei, who instilled the philosophy of lateral thinking with Wither technology within the company. Essentially, this philosophy states that consumers are not drawn to technology for technology's sake, but rather to the experiences enabled by that technology, putting novelty and fun to the forefront of what makes a game console or toy important. This means that Nintendo should design products using mature technologies that can easily be mass-produced, instead of pushing the forefront of technology. And as long as the experiences are comparable or better to those using more advanced technology, people would be willing to pay as much for it, generally translating to more profits. There was no better confirmation of that philosophy than the Game Boy. Just around the time Nintendo entered development on a follow-up to the Game Boy in 1996, something huge happened that revitalized sales of the system: the release of the first-generation Pokemon games. This massive surge in sales would make them pump the brakes and ultimately shelve the newly begun Project Atlantis, which looked an awful lot like an early take on the Game Boy Advance's hardware specs, and divert their resources into the Game Boy Color, a much cheaper to implement revision on the existing monochromatic Game Boy hardware platform that they could get out faster to capitalize on Pokemania. The cancellation of Project Atlantis is pretty important to the handheld console landscape as the WonderSwan is being developed. It was an open secret in the industry that hardware much more capable than the almost 10-year-old Game Boy platform was now possible at a comparable or even cheaper price point. But no one was really able to compete with the Game Boy's massive library of games and exclusive intellectual property to force them to make a move and compete on specs again. But if anyone had a shot at it, it was Bandai. Bandai was a long-established toy company which sold a lot of toys and figures based on anime and tokusatsu series that they either owned, distributed, or had licensing agreements for. But their plan towards integrating into more and more of the entertainment industry and animation production pipeline was long underway. They owned anime studios, voice acting talent agencies, home video distribution, music distribution, and importantly to us, they owned video game studios as well. Bandai at this time was most well known for its Banpresto subsidiary, who would mainly produce games based on the Gundam, Kamen Rider, and Ultraman franchises, as well as the massively successful Super Robot Tyson series, which served as a massive crossover game and license negotiation miracle for fans of anime featuring giant robots. Throughout the Famicom and Super Famicom eras, Bandai would put out a ton of games based on franchises that they owned or had licensing deals for, and even tried to circumvent Nintendo's licensing fee structure altogether by releasing peripherals that could sidestep their stronghold on distribution, such as the Datac and Sufami Turbo. If you've got exclusive rights to produce video games for some of the hottest anime properties, controlling your own system where you don't have to constantly pay another company licensing fees may start to look pretty enticing, and that's exactly what the WonderSwan project would enable them to do. Funnily enough, after the completion of the Game Boy Pocket redesign in 1996, Yokoi would resign from Nintendo and start his own product design company, Koto Laboratory. Through Koto Laboratory, Yokoi would lead the development of WonderSwan hardware until his death in a car accident in October of 1997. By simply applying the same product design philosophy 7 years after the original Game Boy, the end result was a much more capable WonderSwan, selling for 2/3 the price of a Game Boy Pocket. at an introductory price point of 4,800 yen. A year and a half later, the WonderSwan Color would do it all over again, offering visuals comparable to the yet unreleased Game Boy Advance for 3/4 the price of a brand new Game Boy Color. The WonderSwan makes use of a 3.072 MHz NEC V30MZ processor, and the base system has 16 KB of RAM. The V30MZ is a lower voltage variant of the NEC V30, which is notable for being a pin-compatible clone of Intel's 8086, the processor that would kick off the first generation of Intel's x86 architecture and an ancestor of Intel and AMD CPUs released today. The V30 was also briefly used as the processor in the 1985 lineup of NEC's PC9801 line of home computers, and included as a compatibility feature in future models. PC9801 made up almost half of the Japanese home computer market in 1989 and would be massively influential in Japan's PC gaming history. Naturally, the choice of this processor made the WonderSwan an attractive platform for developers with a history of working on the PC98 and early adopters of IBM PC clones. The original WonderSwan uses a monochrome, film-compensated, super-twisted pneumatic LCD, measuring 6.3 cm diagonally with a resolution of 224 by 144 pixels. FSTN is the same display technology used within the Game Boy Pocket years earlier to improve the contrast and readability of the display when compared to the original DMG Game Boy. Monochrome WonderSwan games only have access to a palette of 16 shades of gray to work with, which is 4 times more than the original Game Boy's 4 shades. If you've ever noticed screen tearing when watching footage of WonderSwan games captured on 60Hz displays, that's because the WonderSwan runs at a rather strange 75.47 Hz refresh rate. On December 9, 2000, Bandai released the WonderSwan Color. It replaced the monochrome FSTN display with a color super twisted pneumatic LCD, coming in slightly larger than its older brother with a 7.4 cm diagonal. WonderSwan Color features a 4096 color palette, but games can only use 240 of them at once. The color system also has 4 times the RAM of the monochrome system, now coming in at 64 KB. Much like the original WonderSwan, the WonderSwan Color sports a contrast dial that you can use to adjust the visibility of the display, and that's where I need to bring up that I can't seem to dial in a setting on mine that makes monochromatic games look as good as they do on the original WonderSwan. It always feels like some shade of gray is being lost somewhere, and it can make some games look pretty bad in comparison. In recent years, display replacement kits have been made for the WonderSwan Color, allowing you to swap out the CSTN display with a more modern backlit IPS display. I don't own one of these kits myself, but if you're sensitive to screen tearing, you should be aware that there are very mixed reports on how well these panels handle the strange 75Hz refresh rate of the WonderSwan. But the ultimate in WonderSwan luxury would drop on July 12, 2002 with the release of the Swan Crystal. The Swan Crystal is a slimmer, sleeker WonderSwan Color, but with a massively improved thin film resistor color display with better responsiveness, contrast, and viewing angles. Only about 850,000 Swan Crystal systems were ever sold, so these are the most scarce of the 3 variants and are currently seeking some pretty outrageous prices on the secondary market as a result. The Swan Crystal doesn't have a contrast dial like its FSTN and CSTN counterparts. It has one fixed contrast setting, and that setting is perfect out of the box. I was actually shocked when I got the Swan Crystal late last year at how good this display looks. I didn't know a non-backlit TFT display could look this good, and it's an easy second to the Playdate in my ranking of most impressive non-backlit LCDs. WonderSwan systems are powered by a single AA battery. The original WonderSwan gets a very respectable 40 hours of battery life. The WonderSwan Color gets around 20 hours, and the Swan Crystal gets about 15 hours. One tip for anyone planning to pick up a WonderSwan online is that these are the only handhelds I can think of where the battery contacts are built into the battery cover and not the console itself. It's not uncommon to find cheap WonderSwans on eBay without the battery cover, so don't buy one unless you've already got a spare on hand, otherwise you won't be able to boot it up at all. Each WonderSwan model has the same set of controls. The left side of the system features 2 directional pads labeled Y on top and X on bottom. The right side of the system has 2 action buttons labeled A and B. Under the screen you can find the sound button, which cycles between the volume levels, the start button, and on WonderSwan Color and Swan Crystal, there is a power button here to replace the side-mounted power switch on the original WonderSwan. One quirk of the WonderSwan's hardware layout is how its 2 directional pads occasionally enable games to be played in the portrait orientation. Simply rotate the system so both the directional pads are facing the bottom, and then the Y directional pad on the left will generally serve for movement, and the X directional pad on the right will generally serve as actions. Some games even support upside down play, relying solely on the Y directional pad for input. The onboard firmware also allows you to add in a few personal details such as your name, birth date, gender, and blood type. The name is displayed on the splash screen as the console boots, and other games can read this data and do things with them. Most commonly it's used to seed a random number generator, and I can't remember anything that has used these values for anything cooler than that in the lineup I've seen so far. While I'm on the topic, the WonderSwan also contains a small portion of writable persistent memory that can be read across various game titles. This was very sparingly used, but most notably it was used to transfer save data between the 3 different cartridges that make up the Super Robot Taisen Compact 2 trilogy. Speaking of cartridges, one thing I really appreciate about the WonderSwan is how the back of the system shows off the art on the label of the cartridge you're playing. In a Game Boy, the whole cartridge slides into the slot, and because of that, most of the label is going to be obscured during play. On a WonderSwan, only the part of the cartridge with contacts goes into the cartridge slot and the rest of it stays fully exposed. Much like on the Game Boy line of handhelds, cartridges that are compatible with the monochrome system are differentiated from those that are exclusive to the color system. Monochrome WonderSwan games have a black cartridge, whereas WonderSwan color exclusives have a clear translucent cartridge like most Game Boy Color games did. We're just scratching the surface here. There are also a ton of really interesting accessories released for the WonderSwan, like the aforementioned Wonder Witch development kit, the Wonderborg remote control robot, the Wonder Gate to connect to the internet with your mobile phone, or the Wonder Wave to beam data over infrared, usually with a Sony Pocket Station. All of these are really cool, but I don't own any of them right now. But if I ever do, then I'll be sure to make videos about them. When I started this video series, I was always worried that I might end up proving the naysayers from the mid-2000s right. Who wants to embark on a project and feel like they've wasted the last 4 years playing garbage, right? Very quickly, it became apparent to me that there was a lot more nuance to this game library than anyone wanted to admit, and I had a lot of fun sharing the games that I enjoyed and giving more context to still be able to appreciate the games that missed the mark to some degree. With just a little more than half the library left to cover, I hope you'll stick around for the rest of the ride, because from what I've been told, I haven't even gotten to the really sweet stuff yet.